Hi, Lit Up listeners. Before we get to this episode, we want to take a moment to address the June 24th Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. This decision stripped away the legal right to have a safe and legal abortion. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all Americans. This decision could also lead to the loss of other rights. To learn more about what you can do to help, go to choice.crd.co. We encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word. From Sugar 23, I am Angela Ledgerwood, and this is Lit Up. Today I'm speaking with one of my favorite women to talk to, Lisa Taddeo. She has been on Lit Up twice already, and this is her third time back to talk about her new collection of stories called Ghost Lover. You've probably heard of her work already. Three Women was an absolutely outrageous sensation, as was her follow-up novel Animal. Now, there's a reason I always love to talk to Lisa, and it's actually not because I adore reading her work, and I will explain why. I find reading her work really difficult, and that's because I feel she's so good at getting to the heart of the female psyche and mind. And I often find that I don't want to go there with her. I'm not in the mood to get emotional and to really connect to a character in the way that Lisa forces me to with her work. Yeah, I definitely get that tummy dropping feeling. And sometimes reading her work makes me feel kind of edgy and vulnerable. But I think that's because I'm forced to peel back those layers of protection that I have in everyday life to just like get on with the world. And her stories force me to kind of cut through all that. I think I am not alone, and so many people have this experience with her work, which is why we're both drawn to it and sometimes kind of repelled by it. So while reading Lisa's work makes me feel like I'm really excavating those darker aspects of myself and of womanhood, I find talking to Lisa Taddeo a totally joyous experience because she's so warm and open and funny and has like a lightness that I think you'll really enjoy. And she's one of my favorite guests because of this exact reason. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. 3 times, 3 books.
I love talking to you every time. Thank you so much for wanting to talk to me again.
Oh my goodness, of course. So firstly, I have to ask, this collection of stories, Ghost Lover, harkens back to the type of provocative wantings of women in general that I think you explored so well in Three Women. At what stage did you start writing these stories compared to Three Women? Was it before? Were some of them happening in between?
I wrote most of them when I was getting my MFA at Boston University. So I wrote them during school then, and that was in the interim between Three Women being sort of finished and kind of like edited. Many were informed by the women that I met and the men that I met researching that book. It's hard to say like where my life ended and Three Women research began. And so I feel like the stories in Ghost Lover, some of them come from just my regular life, my friends, myself, my observations mainly of the way that we judge one another as women. And a lot of it is meant to sort of provoke, as you correctly said, in the sense of like you have probably seen yourself doing this, or someone you know has done this. For me, it's kind of like exposing the stuff that we don't necessarily want to believe about one another. I think that did start with Three Women. Like when I was writing about Lena, the housewife in rural Indiana, I was conscious of the fact that if I talked about her having suicidal thoughts that people would condemn her as a bad mother and not want to listen to her story anymore. With Maggie, the young woman who had the alleged relationship with the teacher in North Dakota, I knew that, like, talking about other things she had done and such would give people reason to go, oh, well, then she probably meant to do that too. But at the same time as knowing those unfortunate residuals of telling the truth, I also felt like it made the most sense to tell the truth, that telling the truth, even in satire, even in hyper realized, almost hyperbole of the way that we can be, is the best way to sort of reach that inner core of where we can find empathy for one another.
When I was reading these stories, I got the classic Lisa Taddeo tummy drop, which happens with all your work. The voice of your women is so unique to your style, and it's so direct and visceral. That's why I call it the tummy drop, because I know you're getting to the guts of the issues or the situation or the real women's thoughts. And I think so often in life, it's so much safer to guard ourselves against those feelings. So I feel it was like, okay, I'm going to read 2 more stories and see where they take us. But one in particular, which I think, really hits upon something that if you've been dating in this modern world, you can relate to. And it's a character called Grace. And she's gone on an app called Venus, and she's older. She's 51 and she's trying to lie about her age. And it's the kind of app that you have to be invited on. And I wondered, like, why explore that vantage point for this character? Maybe that vantage point is just having been young once and not being so anymore, and how we look at and judge younger women, but how we also want to still be one.
Yeah.
What was that story about?
So for me, ageism, it's such a wild thing. It's a wild notion to me that anyone is ageist, because we're all there is no truer truth until we figure out, cryogenesis, than the fact that we're all going to get older. And yet it feels like older women, and by older women, I mean like wherever one draws the line is different depending on the group of people and whatever. But let's say Grace, right, who is 51, if she were to meet, and I think it's different with Grace because I think Grace has a lot of self-awareness. But if a 51-year-old woman in Grace's general position of being single, and not just being single, but of having had a real rough early beginnings to things. Not a lot of the women in my stories don't have the benefit of a good head start in life. I think that a 51-year-old woman looking to date, right? Looking at let's say a 21-year-old woman, someone 30 years her junior, there's this fracture immediately, right? Where the older woman often thinks that the younger woman does not know anything, that she's just making silly mistakes or taking her youth for granted. The younger woman, in turn, often looks at the older woman and thinks, oh God, like, how sad, how pathetic, I'll never be there. And the truth is that, the 51-year-old woman was where the 21-year-old woman was, and the 21-year-old woman will, God willing, be where the 51-year-old woman is. And the idea that we don't sort of take those 30 years and look at them and see how we can have a conversation with each other about what happens, and how the young person can remind the older person of what was there of hope and other things, to that end, I find very sad. It's like we're not allowed to have these negative feelings. We're not allowed to have these negative observations about ourselves. And Grace feels like she needs to lie on the dating site because she has seen more examples of how it doesn't work out than how it does. And yet we are still taught to do the same thing, to believe in the same hopes and dreams, to, to not knock our age, to not get Botox, to not, do XYZ, at the same time that there is literally an entire industry telling us that if we don't, we are expired milk. The split between what we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to grow and the wisdom we're supposed to have and what we actually have to deal with on a daily basis, to me, is such a wild canyon of a difference that I like exploding it and talking about it, because I feel like we just pretend it doesn't exist.
Do you think it exists more in certain places? Because I identified a lot. Well, a lot of the stories take place in Los Angeles or New York, two very particular cities that revere youth, beauty, success,
Hmm.
and are quite very status oriented. And I feel like you capture that so well and so uniquely within the writing about each city. What has your experience been in these places and how they each kind of form and mold a culture around beauty and age?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, for one, I've lived in many places. I lived in LA. I've lived in New York the most. I feel like LA really does bring out the ageism thing more so than in New York. That being said, I think that while New York and LA like are sort of put this great value on beauty and age, they also have the most room for people of different ages getting together, but it's only at the sort of upper echelons that that happens. So, if you go out to kind of middle America, it's there's less of a value on beauty and age because it's not in your face, but it's still there. It's just kind of like it's just very watered down. And I think actually that that's why in the titular story Ghost Lover, the woman Ari, who is suffering from a lot of these same feelings, is building this whole business essentially in the hopes that that will make her appealing to this person. It's not about, in the end, being appealing to a man. For me, it's being appealing to yourself. But our culture has put that in the terms of how a man views you in so many ways. And certainly for women in Grace's generation and a little bit younger than that, that's kind of the way that they grew up. It's funny because we talk about how, oh, well, men didn't know that they weren't allowed to whistle until this year. And it's like, okay, well, women didn't know that they weren't allowed to, get Botox until, like, it's just like that we don't make the same allowances for women behaving badly. And I like telling stories about women behaving badly. And by behaving badly, sometimes that means liking the wrong person or being obsessed with someone. But really, the obsession is to find someone who will understand you and for you to understand yourself. And that's really the sort of the constant battle, is to be enough for yourself. But at the same time, when you've been through a lot of grief and pain, being alone in it is kind of the most devastating thing. So a lot of these women are coming from something very dark and disturbed and are needing more than just, a kind of self help on how to find yourself in Manhattan.
I feel like so many of these women and women in general are trapped still within seeing themselves within the male gaze. And I feel part of what's happening now in our culture, which is really positive, is breaking that and finding confidence. Well, from within, which sounds kind of cliche, but we all need that. But there does seem to be a shift happening that women are taking back the gays. Do you sense that? Because my feeling is that the women in these stories are trapped in kind of before those before years? And I'm talking just like a few years ago.
I think that for younger generations, I think that women in their 20s right now and I'm saying this because of, the women in their 20s that I've met and know, um, I feel like are markedly better at voicing their needs and wants and at not making it all about a man. At the same time, I also think that we've gotten worse to each other. And I think people in my generation and older are still kind of stuck in that rut of women kind of shaming one another, whether privately or publicly. And I think younger women do that a lot less. So I think there's a lot of hope. I think a lot of that comes from Me Too, obviously. And I think also, we just have general cultural evolution that brings us forward, even if sometimes it involves taking a couple of steps back.
Hey, Lit Up listeners, I want to tell you about a show I think you'll enjoy. It's called Play on Podcasts, epic audio adventures that reimagine Shakespeare's timeless tales, featuring original music composition and the voices of award-winning actors. Each episode explores plays from Macbeth to A Midsummer Night's Dream in a way that you can actually understand, and created specifically for the podcast form by some of America's most exciting playwrights, directors, and composers, and performed by Stage and Screen's best. Check out their current season of King Lear that stars Emmy winner Keith David and Severance star Tramell Tillman. Hear Shakespeare like you've never heard before. Subscribe to Play on Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Well, can you also explain in Ghost Lover exactly the service that Ari comes up with? And I feel like it's almost like having that best friend, the one that's so clever and witty and always grabs your phone to go, oh, you cannot write that, you crazy woman, like write this.
Mm-hmm.
So what
Yeah.
is this app and
Well,
where can we download it?
well, it's exactly what you just said is where that sort of came from. My friends and I would be, in Manhattan in our 20s, like rewatching old episodes of Sex in the City and like trying to figure out like how to be happy, how to be successful in New York. And we would be concurrently, unpacking these text messages from significant others or non-significant others. And then we would be like, here, just take my phone, take it for the night. Don't let me write them back. Just take my phone. But then, eventually, like, 11 p.m. hits and it's like, just give it back. I just need to. So my feeling was, what if you're paying for someone to essentially mother you through this process that you're not going to go back on? And so the idea was that, like, having one of those witty friends would be a group of witty women who would know and also some men perhaps in there too, would know exactly what to say and how to craft a response that would yield the desired result from the crush. So yeah, I just love the idea of like a glassy building somewhere in LA where there's like a switchboard and all these women are just like sitting there going like, oh, Joe just texted, like this team made up essentially of people who might be your friends, but they're not your friends. You're paying them and you have to pay them and you're gonna accept what they give you.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I'm glad Ari finds success with it, because I also think you'd have to plug in to the system your weaknesses, the certain
Right.
things that you
Yeah.
have a certain problem with, or what it's always about what you think he wants to hear, which is also so dumb, isn't it? Because the real way to weed out the guys that
Mhm.
aren't right for you is to be honest. But I guess in the beginning of things, it's always tricky.
When you're in the beginning of something, you are your best self. That's why a lot of people cheat. That's the reason for most infidelity, is because you're like, oh, I want to, look my best today, and I want to be really happy, and I want to be loving towards the world because I want this person to see how loving I am. But when you're in a shitty mood, or you've been in a relationship for a couple of years and everything is ho hum or whatever, you're not doing that stuff for yourself and for your partner. The idea of being honest, right? Like with someone, there's a lot of lines for that. And it's hard to know what the line is. I think there's like a new move in like women going, oh no, don't play games, don't do that, no playing games, no, that's antiquated, that's what our moms did. And it's, for me, it's not. I don't think it's antiquated to play games. And I think the word playing games is a misnomer for what is essentially putting on the best version of yourself. And I think that sometimes we need help doing that, the same way we need help prepping for SATs.
I also think we need help even after we've been in a relationship for a few years. Like, I think it's good to
Mm-hmm.
almost take stock and
Totally.
go, I think I need to tap back into that original best self, like you
Yeah,
said, for myself, but also for that other person, to give them a glimpse of that person again.
exactly.
How do you do that,
I don't. I
Lisa?
don't do it at all. I am so terrible. I've been very busy. So I feel like the thing that I have overlooked the most has definitely been my relationship with my husband. And I'm sure that he would agree. I, I think about it all the time. Not enough, but I do think about it. I'm just like, okay, after I get done with this work week, I will figure out how to get back to being a good wife and, all the rest of it. But it's hard. It just feels like unless they're in grave danger, you're kind of like, okay, I can just let that coast for a little bit longer. But that's how the grave danger happens.
Isn't it? Because I mean, I think of the women in your stories, and maybe women around the world and men have connected with these characters because men have many of the same feelings that these women have too.
Hmm.
We've all been each side of the relationship. And even in the current ones, it's an ebb and flow of who is feeling a little more like lovable, and the other one's
Exactly.
feeling like, oh, I need to step it up. But I think I've definitely found myself in that position of like, oh my gosh, I want to love and I want to be in love, knowing, kind of having realistic expectations of what that means, but trying desperately not to be a desperate woman. And
Hmm.
what does that even mean? Because we've felt it and then we've seen it in our friends, and then we kind of do that work to be okay with who we are. But it's hard.
It's really hard. And I also think that we're constantly sort of moving the goalposts on what desperation is and what the right way to be desperate is and what it all means. I'm sure you and I have talked about it too, but like Lena, the woman in Indiana, and Three Women, who reconnects with her high school love because her husband doesn't kiss her or want to touch her. So many people called her pathetic. And that really, really made me sad because I didn't think she was pathetic. I thought that given everything in her life that was going on, and given the fact that she had been raped as a young woman, given all of the things that had lined up to give her this bad start, and now she's finally, within the book, she was finally going after something she actually wanted, and it might not have been the quote unquote right thing to want, but it was the right thing for her, and it was the right thing to get her out of that sort of feeling dead in her life and her marriage and everything. She just felt like she was cleaning the house and taking care of kids, and there was nothing that fed her above and beyond her children. In her community, children and a nice enough home and a nice enough husband who didn't beat her was enough, and wanting more is not okay for Lena. So I think that anyone saying that a woman's desire is pathetic, there's nothing more cruel than to say that about someone else and to kind of make judgments on what is pathetic, what is desperate, how do we not act desperate, why should we not act desperate, why can't we be desperate? You know what I mean? Like, why is that not okay? Desperation is another human emotion. And I think that having this stigma about it is what makes it an even worse emotion to handle than it would be if it were acceptable.
Do you think now, having published Three Women and Animal and now just Ghost Lover, that you've heard from men who feel that they're misrepresented in the stories, or that they identify so strongly as the wanting side of things?
It hasn't been a lot, that's true. I'm really interested because I haven't heard that many. I think that men who are in the wanting space are very much out there. Though I will say, there was a man, I was giving a talk at a literary festival, and there was a man who said something to the effect of, like, you women say you want romance, but like when we give you romance, like you like laugh in our faces and blah blah blah. And he just like stood up and kind of ragefully was pinning on me the sort of everything that was wrong, what we don't understand, we don't know what we want. Some have had like really well formed thoughts and opinions, and others have had less so. I would love to hear well formed thoughts and opinions about the women in my piece, and the men you know, who they're thinking about.
I also want to talk about how your life has changed. I've this phenomenon that has been your work and how it's been received. And I remember when we spoke about Three Women, it was before it had even been published. It was one of those,
Hmm.
pre-interview things, and we
Yeah.
had such a lovely time. And you were talking about your work then in the same way you do now, but the world has had a reaction to you, and you're still Lisa. How how have you processed that?
It's weird a lot of the times because, like, last night I had my book launch event, as we were talking about earlier in Brooklyn. And there were so many women who came and who were just like, "Oh my God, I've read all your stuff." And it was such a different, because the pandemic, even though I did a lot of events for Animal, a lot of them were virtual. So it was interesting to see how things had sort of changed and moved, and people like being aware of me in a new way. But I obviously, as you said, I'm still Lisa. I still regard myself the same way. I am still, and forever, I sadly, I think, will be sort of defined by my trauma and my fears and my anxieties. So for me, it's not like I'm in this like vacuum of like, oh, I've had success as a writer, and and all these things and TV stuff, and it's all exciting. But for me, it's like those same demons that helped me write those books are the same ones that I will always have, and they're the same ones I'll always be.
Well, you mentioned TV too, and I heard that, the series Three Women's coming out soon, but you decided, or tell me who decided, that it was important to have you as a character in there as the piece connecting these three women. Did you
Well,
has it seeing yourself be characterized, has it made you kind of think differently about yourself or just notice things about you?
Shailene Woodley, who is playing the quote unquote me character, is a lot of fictionalized stuff in there, and a lot of it is also real. But, she very much made her own character. Someone said, "Oh my God, that's just like what you do." And I'm like, "Oh my God, did she watch me?" But she's really created this new character that is wholly hers, and I find it really really cool. In terms of the idea for the character, it was actually my husband's idea. And also, and a lot of people that I spoke to about it in general were like, well, you have to be a character. You know that, right? And I would be like, what? No, no, I don't. But what happened when we were starting to kind of write it is we had these distinct three stories, these distinct women. In the book, they're connected by the fact that they're in this book together. And the person who connects them is me, who has found them and been with them and become close to them. And so gradually, when we were like trying to look for other threads to tie the stories together thematically and whatnot, it just never felt real or right. And it's like, well, we have the real thing that actually happened. And so many people who interviewed me about three women continue to, want to know, how did you meet these people? How did you find them? How did you get them to tell you these things? What were those relationships like? And so I felt that the show would be able to give, specifically people who liked the book or read the book, an extra layer behind it. So it's not just a retelling or a reimagining on the screen, but it's like kind of the backstory also.
Mm. And how involved were you then once the script was written? Were you on set all the time? What was that experience like?
I was on set a lot of the time. I was there for much of it. There was and continue to be like 500 emails a day about, colors and wardrobe and every single thing. I mean, of course, I also had a very talented team of people working with me. So if it's terrible, I'll take the blame for it. And if it's good, I
I'm
will
sure
take
it's going to be
some of the
great.
credit for it.
I have to ask, when you found out that Harry Styles was reading Three Women, what was your reaction?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm a huge fan of his, period, but my daughter, who's 7, started being obsessive with him when she was like 5. And so I was so excited to show my daughter the news article because I was like, this is the beginning of me being a cool mom. I'm a cool mom. See, tell all your friends.
Is there fiction or nonfiction that you go to ground yourself, to get back to you, to remind yourself of the writing you love and just to block out the noise?
Yes. I go back to Joy Williams all the time, Barry Hannah, Lucia Berlin, Elena Ferrante, Natalia Ginsburg, William Trevor, Alice Munro. I just, Grace Paley. I go back to the people that are the most beautiful writers that I can think of. Less about plot, more about conveying an entire experience, entire life in one sentence. Those are the writers that I go back to ground myself.
And what lights you up?
Not being afraid on any given day.
Oh, I love that. Isn't that the best when people say, what would you do if you weren't afraid or fearful of things? And I
Yeah,
think,
totally.
wow, okay,
Oh
there'd be
my
some
God.
change. Why don't
Wow.
I do it right
There,
now?
yes, exactly.
Lisa, thank you so, so much. What a
Thank you so
pleasure
much, Angela.
always
I love
it
talking
is.
to you all the time. Thank you.
Well,
Really lovely.
congratulations on the launch of another book. And
Thank
I
you.
can't wait for people to read it and connect with it
Thank
as
you.
they do with all your work.
Thank you so much. I love talking to you every time.
Lit Up is a podcast from Sugar 23. It's hosted by me, Angela Ledgerwood, and is produced by Liam Billingham. Olivia Olmer is the marketing and editorial consultant. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Andrei Verdovsky writes the theme music. See you in 2 weeks.